That's why knowing the Lord and knowing his heart is the beginning of wisdom, because you could confuse true wisdom for foolishness unless you know God's heart.
Whether it's sinful or not, we need to be seeking wisdom. God calls us to seek wisdom because having his wisdom is first understanding who he is.
What are we talking about today, Jacob?
Yeah, so we kind of got a question here, and it's one that is hopefully going to make us think and challenge us, because that's one of the things we want to do with this is bring things that are going to challenge our thinking in our walk and in our faith, right?
Yeah.
So our first question of the day is foolishness sinful? Kind of what we see in that, how we walk this out, and how we deal with issues that arise out of this. So do you want to kind of intro us on your thoughts?
Yeah, so to kind of fill the question out, is things that the Bible describes as foolish, are they therefore sinful? I had to ask a pastor friend this recently because I was just like, there was a situation that arose where it was like, I mean, the Bible doesn't clearly say that this is a sin, but it does seem to talk about it as if it's a bad idea, you know? And so it's like, does that then mean that something that the Bible would call foolish is wrong in a sin holiness sense, or is it okay, you know? So that's kind of the question. I have been thinking about this for a couple weeks now, and I'm really not sure about the answer. I want to lean towards, let me say this. I am sure that there is a right answer in each individual circumstance. I don't know that you can put one blanket like, yeah, it's always right or it's always wrong on every circumstance in which a foolish action might be required.
It's more of a gray area.
It is. It's a lot more gray than clear.
Yeah. So, and when I say that, I don't mean like every situation is gray. I'm just saying the overall idea of foolishness being sin is kind of gray. You know, like we have to use the Holy Spirit to guide us in these situations, and also our knowledge of Scripture, I think, to guide us in these situations. So I think kind of what we're looking to do today is to fill out this gray area and say, okay, what are some instances that we can kind of point to in this gray area, and what are some that maybe we still aren't completely sure on? So, I think that's kind of what we want to do today.
Well, let's start by just examining what the Bible considers foolishness to be. I'm wondering if we should just start in like Proverbs. Yeah, let's go to Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 1.
Okay, yeah.
So at the beginning of the book of Proverbs, wisdom is personified as a lady. And it says this in verse 20, wisdom cries aloud in the street, and in the markets she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy streets she cries out. At the entrance of the city gate she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing, and fools hate knowledge? And she goes on to talk about knowledge being wisdom, and that the beginning of wisdom is knowing the Lord. So like being in the will of God is the beginning of where wisdom and knowledge in a biblical sense begins. That doesn't mean that like to know things about the world, like, you know, to be a scientist or a chemist or, a math teacher or something like that you have to then be a Christian. It more means that when it comes to knowledge of the spiritual world and knowledge of moral truth, it begins with knowing the heart of God. And so that's why I think foolishness is such a tricky thing, because it doesn't necessarily draw you away from the heart of God, but it doesn't bring you closer to him either. It's just kind of somewhere in the middle.
A little bit to add to that, too, is that, you know, the Bible also tells us that we can have all knowledge and all wisdom, but without love, it's useless, right? I know we bring this up a lot, but the beauty in that statement is that, you could be the wisest person on the planet, the smartest person on the planet, and still be foolish.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the crazy dynamic of it is without the Lord, all of it lends itself to being foolish. So where we have to go with that is understanding that we need Christ in us and working through us to avoid foolishness.
Right.
And again, whether it's sinful or not, the Bible tells us to seek after wisdom.
Yes.
Right? So we have to understand that in the beginning is whether it's sinful or not, we need to be seeking wisdom. God calls us to seek wisdom because having his wisdom is first understanding who he is.
Yeah.
So
it's like knowing his identity.
Yeah, exactly. And like how big of a thing is that to know God, right?
Yeah.
Secondly, something else you said about, being smart or whatever, like Christ also tells us to be ready to give an answer, right? In 1 Peter, it talks about being ready to give an answer for the faith that we have received.
Yeah.
So knowing that, that is a level of wisdom that we can get from Christ as well, from letting him work through us and having that zeal to know him and to know his word and to know the apologetics and the theology and all the things me and you love.
Yeah.
Like, this is what we need to be seeking after, because our faith should define every part of our life, including the things we enjoy learning about, right?
You're reminding me as well. There's a passage in one of Paul's letters. It's like one of the early Corinthian letters. It's either one or two, because there's only two options for Corinthian letters. Where he describes the gospel being foolishness to those who are perishing, right? To the people who going to the cross in order to win the world doesn't make any sense in the context in which it happened. Like the ancient Romans and the ancient Jews, it was like a disgrace to be crucified. It was awful. And yet it was the act that brought about the salvation and the redemption of all who would place their faith in Christ. And so, it's foolish to the world, but it's wisdom to God. And that's why knowing the Lord and knowing his heart is the beginning of wisdom, because you could confuse true wisdom for foolishness unless you know God's heart.
Yeah. It's funny you actually say that, because I actually have a little story that goes along with that.
Yeah.
I believe I was in middle school at the time, and I remember the first time I'd heard somebody scoff about the Bible. And, I wasn't very studied at that time.
Well, you were in middle school. No one's very studied.
But even to the degree that other kids were, I still didn't know a whole lot. Like, my family, we just didn't grow up in church, if that makes sense. So, a lot of it came later for me. But nevertheless, I remember this guy explaining the gospel in such a just demeaning way. I mean, it was like, so you created these people to come down as one of these people, to die, to get rid of sin. Like, it was just such a demeaning way. And I forget the exact way in which he put it, but it was something that
it's like God sent himself to save us from himself or something.
Yeah,
like some sort of caricature of the real gospel. Yeah,
exactly. Something that just obviously demeaned it, right?
Yeah.
And so that was the first time I'd ever experienced that. And I was like, man, that's not it. Like, I knew at least enough at that point to know, like, that's not it. Like, that's not right. But I also don't know how to fight against that, because at the time I was not in his word like I am now. So I was like, looking back on that, actually, I'm like, man, I'm so glad I'm at this point now, but also, like, being able to give out our wisdom that we've received to those that might be in situations like that and have never encountered or know how to deal with it.
Yeah,
so.
and what's interesting, you brought up that 1 Peter passage before about having an answer prepared for the hope within us. What's interesting about that passage is, like, we on this channel have been trying to give reasons why your faith doesn't have to be built on just blind faith. You don't have to jump to conclusions in order to get there, but you can logically come to this conclusion without having to go against any type of, just obvious truth. But I think the point of what Peter is saying there is, like, it doesn't have to look like memorizing, arguments for the existence of Christ or for the existence of, or for, the resurrection or things like that. It doesn't consist in just that. It's like, if you have faith, have an answer prepared for why. Don't just be like, I don't know, I just believe it because my parents said so. Like, have an answer and then be ready, be prepared to defend it. Be prepared to defend your faith.
Yeah. And also, we have to have wisdom in that too, because, one of the things being the foolish things is to be able to argue with a fool whenever they don't want anything but to argue, right? So we have to be wise when we're witnessing to people as well, because we can easily fall into the trap of, okay, you're just 1,000 questions, but it's all just to try and tear my belief down. Whereas, hey, if you genuinely want to have a conversation, that's one thing. Or if you genuinely want to know, or, you genuinely have a question, like, those are all fine and dandy.
Yeah.
And to a certain degree, we do have to engage even when there is that argumentation. So there is that balance of knowing when to and when not to, right?
Yeah. Answer a fool according to his folly, and you'll become like him. Don't answer a fool according to his folly, or you'll be a fool yourself, or something like that. It's like a proverb where it's like two proverbs back to back, and they say two contradictory things, but it's because how you handle a fool changes situation to situation.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about a situation where, I know of people that they put themselves strongly in camps and are not willing to listen to anything else. And it's because their heart is closed off. Mm-hmm. And so, like, if I come at them saying, well, here's all these facts, like undeniable facts, fact, they're just going to blow them off and say, well, that doesn't matter. What about these things?
Yeah.
It's just going to be this never-ending cycle. It's because their heart's never going to be open to it. And that's fine. But in that situation, I wouldn't want to keep approaching facts. I'd want to say, hey, like, why don't we deal with this heart issue?
Yeah.
If this conversation
How about we address your bias first?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Like, I think one question that can help too is like, hey, what question would I have to answer in order for you to believe in God? And that's such a profound thing for a lot of people because they've never been asked it. They never thought, oh, what would it take for me to believe in this? To change my entire worldview. Yeah. And sometimes it can get to the bottom of it and it's a simple question. Yeah. And it's like, hey, it's this. And some people are going to say, yeah, nothing. It still doesn't affect me. Yeah.
Some people would just say there isn't anything that could convince me. Even if you gave me evidence, even if God wrote my name in the sky, it wouldn't convince me.
Exactly. And at that point you have to have the wisdom enough to go, okay, I'm going to lay this down. I still love you and I still care about you, but I've got to lay this down. Yeah. I have to move on.
Yeah. Because at that point, all right, well then nothing that I could ever tell you will change your mind. So what's the point? Why even argue about this at this point? Nothing that I could say is going to change your mind. Nothing that you say to me is going to change mine. So it's an immovable object meets the, whatever, the unstoppable force.
Yeah. But I think the important thing, though, to land on is still in love, because if you're witnessing to somebody or dealing with a foolish situation, you always want to land on love. Like, hey, I still disagree with you. That's fine. We have to agree to disagree. But I love you. Yeah. And I believe in a God that I believe loves you as well. And, that's where you kind of have to leave things. Because if you leave it in a state of, well, we're just going to have to disagree, then they just fall back further in the camp. But I think it always leaves that door open when you say, hey, let's end this in love,
Yeah, like when they know that your heart is for them. It's like, hey, if you know that I am a Christian, then you know that I believe that in order to be right and be reconciled with God, you must go through Jesus Christ, And if you know I believe that, it would be very unloving of me to not tell you that. It actually would be incredibly rude of me and incredibly uncaring and unfeeling of you and in our relationship for you to know I believe you could be destined to hell apart from Christ and to keep that information from you. That isn't love to keep that information to yourself. If you really believe this, if you really believe Jesus is God and that those who do not go through him, will not be reconciled to God, then yeah, you should be telling people about your faith, So it might be an uncomfortable topic or an uncomfortable subject, but that ultimately is part of proving that it is what you believe is by being willing to stand up for it.
For those that have seen the cussing video, you've already heard this, but one of the examples is, recently you had a flat tire and you called me for help. And if I would have been like, man, that's so stupid, like, why don't you know how to change a tire? That would have been wrong on me because I'm acting out of anger and out of ignorance, or annoyance or whatever. Yeah. But instead, I helped you through it. And not even that you needed that much help because you knew most of what was going on. It's just, a few little things because I used to work in a tire shop. So you wanted to make sure you were going to be safe. And so I'm like, okay, cool. And I helped you through it. So that's where I could have went wrong on it. But on the other hand, if I were to see you with your tires, with the steel showing out of them, right? And hey, your tire is about to go out. Don't do this. This is a stupid thing to do. Yeah. That wouldn't be wrong because I'm looking...
You're being a fool.
Yeah, or you're being a fool for letting your tires go this long. That's not a wrong thing for me to say. It would be, hey, I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to bring you along. I'm not acting out of anger. I'm acting out of sincerity and care. Yeah. So it all goes back to the heart posture, like what you were saying. It's all about how are we doing these things and why are we doing these things. So I think that's a huge importance of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and to kind of bring this all back together, then, is foolishness sinful? No, but yes. It's gray. There isn't really like a straightforward answer as far as like, yeah, this is definitely wrong or this is definitely right. It depends on the circumstance and the situation.
Yes. Yes.